Teenagers mocked Clint Eastwood in a theater, completely unaware of the legendary figure sitting before them. What followed was a powerful lesson in respect, one they would never forget. It was a typical day at the Geffen Theater in LA, where the iconic film Where Eagles Dare was being screened to honor the bravery of the Allied forces who fought against the Nazis. To the surprise of the theater staff, a tall figure entered quietly, drawing no attention as he made his way to the front row. It was none other than Clint Eastwood, the star of the very film being shown, and the man behind some of Hollywood's biggest 90s hits. An older staff member recognized Clint and hesitated before approaching him. With a respectful nod, he said, "Sir, we actually have some better seats available up front. Would you like to move?" Clint, ever humble, glanced up with a slight raise of his eyebrow. "Do I not look comfortable?" he asked, his voice calm but amused. The staff member stammered, "It's just... you're Clint Eastwood." Clint gave a small chuckle. "Yeah. And right now, I'm just a guy watching a movie." He leaned back in his seat. "You do your job, son. I'll be just fine right here." The staff member stood there for a moment, processing the unexpected response. Then, with a quiet nod, he stepped away, leaving Clint to enjoy the film like everyone else. As the scene unfolded, the old movie began, its opening credits barely passing when a voice from the back row echoed, "Leave the old man here. How much time does he have left? Let us watch the movie." Suddenly, laughter erupted from behind Clint. The staff member standing nearby moved to respond, but Clint raised a hand to stop him. "They're just spoiled kids," Clint said calmly. "Don't waste your time on them." He gestured for the staff to return to his spot, demonstrating a level of composure that only added to the quiet dignity of the moment. Though Clint wasn't pleased by the remark, his years of experience had taught him that not every comment deserved a response. But the jabs didn't stop. "Looks like the old man's here for some nostalgia," one voice sneered. Laughter followed, and another chimed in, "Why are we even watching this old crap?" For a moment, Clint's thoughts drifted to the stark contrast before him, the lack of respect, the erosion of history. He reflected on how easily people had forgotten the sacrifices made to build this nation, and the heroic efforts that led to the defeat of the Nazis. To Clint, it felt as though he had been transported back to the German era, but this time the disrespect was coming from within America itself. He glanced behind him and saw 3 teenagers clad in gang-style leather jackets, accompanied by a guy who flashed a smile at Clint, a smile meant to distance him from the group. The 2 teenagers who had been laughing suddenly stopped, one of them sneering, "Hey, oldie, got a problem?" Clint, unfazed, shot back, "No, I don't. But your parents' upbringing might." His no-nonsense response was enough to silence them. Their limited minds couldn't quite comprehend Clint's words, leaving them momentarily confused. As the opening credits ended and the movie began, the theater rang with applause when the young Clint Eastwood made his on-screen entrance. "Damn, he looks amazing," one of the teenagers commented, oblivious to the fact that the very person they had mocked was sitting right in front of them. Clint couldn't help but smile to himself, reflecting on how many lives he had influenced and how many were experiencing that admiration in the present moment. For a moment, it seemed as though the teenagers had finally quieted down, but one couldn't let go of the insult. Determined to make Clint's experience uncomfortable, he muttered, "Can this old man even hear the movie?" His friends erupted in laughter. It felt as though he was intent on ruining the movie night, but his teacher, sensing the rising tension, quickly intervened and told him to be quiet. Yet, teenagers, often driven by unchecked egos, struggled to hold back. He continued, "Old man, how old are you?" Then, his friend beside him mocked in a high-pitched voice, I forgot, maybe 90, and both burst into loud laughter, disturbing the entire theater. A few audience members sitting behind them exchanged disapproving glances, whispering, "What's wrong with them? Not only are they disturbing us, but they're also disrespecting an elderly man." One of them muttered in response, "It's their parents' fault. They should have taught them respect." Refusing to tolerate the mockery, one audience member spoke up, "Hey, shut up! Let us watch the movie in peace!" But the teenagers mocked him as well, showing no regard for anyone around them. Clint, quietly observing the scene, realized that if nothing was done, the situation would spiral out of control. He couldn't let this memory be tainted, and these kids would never stop bothering others. Determined to act, Clint waited for the right moment to intervene. As the movie reached an exciting scene with a jet soaring through the sky, one of the teenagers stood up and said, "Hey, they're lying. Jets can't fly that high. Maybe they're just trying to make old guys like him happy," pointing toward Clint. That was the breaking point for Clint. He knew it was time to act. The audience, growing increasingly frustrated, exchanged worried glances as the teenagers continued to disrupt the experience. The teacher, clearly embarrassed, muttered to himself, "Bringing them here was a mistake." The theater staff approached and asked the teenager to sit down, but he stubbornly replied, "You can't make me stop. It's my freedom of speech." The staff, understanding the legal limits of their authority, realized they couldn't force him out, especially since he was just a teenager. They turned to the teachers, who had witnessed everything firsthand but felt powerless to intervene. Despite their efforts, they couldn't control the disruptive behavior. At that moment, Clint stood up. The soft creak of his seat was barely audible, but the shift in the atmosphere was undeniable. The audience, sensing something was about to happen, turned to watch. A hush fell over the room. The teenagers, still oblivious, chuckled. "Oh, the old man's finally had enough," one of them sneered. Clint took a slow step forward, his boots making a firm, deliberate sound against the carpeted floor. The flickering light from the screen cast deep shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the quiet strength in his expression. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even trying to be intimidating. He simply existed in a way that naturally commanded respect. Then, a voice from the back gasped, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Wait a minute. That's Clint Eastwood." The realization hit like a shockwave. A murmur rippled through the theater, followed by stunned silence. One of the teenagers blinked, confused. "Clint who?" The third teenager, the quiet one, suddenly stiffened. His eyes widened as he turned to his friends. "Dude, Clint Eastwood. The guy from the movie. The guy standing right in front of us." The other two stared at Clint, their smirks fading. The legend they had been mocking for the past 20 minutes had been sitting just feet away from them the entire time. Clint let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Ain't no big deal, kid," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. He gestured toward the paused screen, where his younger self stood mid-action, rifle in hand. "That's me." The teenagers swallowed hard. Their arrogance drained in an instant, replaced by something they weren't used to feeling. Respect, and maybe even a little awe. Clint sighed, his tone softening. "You were laughing at this movie a few minutes ago. Thought it was old. Outdated. I get it. Time moves fast." He glanced at the screen before turning back to them. "But some things don't get old. Things like courage, sacrifice, respect." The teenagers were frozen, listening. The audience remained silent, waiting for what Clint would say next. "Respect isn't something you demand," he continued. "It's something you give, and in return, you might just earn it back." The school management, clearly embarrassed, rushed in to address the situation. "We sincerely apologize for the behavior of these students. This is completely unacceptable." Clint, calm and unwavering, shook his head. "They need to understand an important lesson," he replied firmly. He leaned in slightly, his voice steady but firm. "Earlier, one of you said jets can't fly that high. Let me clear that up." He paused, ensuring they were listening. Jets can fly at over 40,000 feet, higher than any commercial plane, and break the sound barrier at speeds over 1,500 miles per hour. He stepped closer, locking eyes with them. "So, when you talk without knowledge, it's not a joke, it's ignorance. That's the level of stupidity you're operating on." The teenagers, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted in their seats. They couldn't meet his gaze. The weight of Clint's words was beginning to sink in, but still, arrogance clung to them. One of them scoffed, crossing his arms. "Yeah, whatever." he muttered. "We're just messing around. Not like we care about jets or anything." Another teenager chimed in, forcing a smirk. "What? You think we're supposed to believe everything we see in movies? It's all fake anyway." Their defiance was thin, masking their discomfort, unwilling to fully admit they were wrong. Clint studied them for a long moment. He sighed, then removed his hand from the teenager's shoulder, his gaze piercing. "You might think it's a joke," he said calmly, his voice carrying quiet authority. "But you either respect this theater, or you leave." Without waiting for a response, Clint turned and walked back to his seat, his movements slow but sure. The theater, once filled with tension, now sat in a hush as the teenagers sat in stunned silence, their arrogance dissipating. The teenagers opened their mouths to respond, but Clint raised a hand, halting them. His gaze was steady. "Enough," he said, his tone unwavering. "You don't understand humility, do you?" Clint took a step forward, closing the gap between them. The room held its breath. Leaning in slightly, his voice dropped lower, demanding attention. "Your parents would have taught you respect, but you're too caught up in yourselves to see it." He paused, allowing the silence to stretch. "It's not about being right. It's about giving respect to others, no matter who they are." Clint's eyes locked with theirs, his finger tapping his chest as he emphasized his next words. "You'll learn this lesson one way or another. Don't wait too long." The teenagers fell silent, their smug expression slowly fading as the weight of Clint's words settled in. They exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado crumbling. For the first time, they realized how far they'd crossed the line. The confidence they once had in mocking Clint was replaced by guilt. Their minds raced, remembering the warnings from the school management about the consequences of misbehavior. It was no longer a joke. The idea of facing those consequences now seemed far more daunting than anything they'd anticipated. One by one, their posture softened, and the defiant edge vanished from their faces. They could no longer afford to act out. The theater was quiet, and so were they, as the lesson began to sink in. Clint turned and walked back to his seat. The audience, who had been watching in rapt attention, erupted into applause. Cheers and whistles filled the room, a wave of appreciation for the legend who had just shown those teenagers what true humility meant. Some stood up, clapping, while others shouted their admiration. "That's how it's done," one man called out, drawing approving nods from the crowd. "Clint Eastwood, teaching lessons in respect," another voice chimed in. A few shouted, "Legend," and "You're a hero," as Clint made his way back to his seat, acknowledging the applause with a simple nod, as humble as ever. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. What had been an uncomfortable situation moments ago had transformed into a collective triumph for respect, courtesy, and integrity. The teenagers, still frozen in place, couldn't escape the eyes of the crowd, now no longer on their side. The applause continued, a powerful reminder of the values Clint had instilled. The teenagers could only watch, realizing they had just witnessed something far more impactful than they'd expected. As the applause began to fade, Clint settled into his seat. The energy in the room shifted from tension to quiet reflection. The teenagers, now subdued, sat in silence, their earlier arrogance replaced by a newfound awareness. The movie continued on the screen, the jet flying high, but it was clear that something far more meaningful had taken place that evening. The crowd slowly returned to their seats, the discomfort of before replaced with a subtle, shared understanding. Clint remained composed, his actions speaking louder than words. And as the film played on, the lesson lingered. Not just on the screen, but in the hearts of everyone present. If this story moved you, there's so much more to explore. Tap the video on your screen to uncover another compelling tale of respect, humility, and the profound impact of standing up for what's right. Your next unforgettable experience is just a click away. Don't miss out.